Well, we've actually held some meetings on partition over the last year, and really we didn't think we'd exhausted the subject. And as John has said, I've just written a short booklet, uh, basically a rant on the effects of partition. But the way I'm going to approach this tonight, I hope nobody minds, is my favorite saying is the dead past isn't dead. It's not even past. And that's the case in Ireland. And obviously, it's true in a trivial sense in that there's still partition in Ireland. But I think it's true in a different sense as well. And what I want to do is look at three key components of the original issue, struggle around partition. And those three components are imperialism, the democratic forces, which include both nationalism and feminism, which was growing at the time, and of course the workers' movement. And all these movements had their internal contradictions. So I think I want to stress here, because it keeps getting forgotten, imperialism is a description of a world system. And what's really important is how it expresses itself instead of what tends to happen, which is a sort of lazy, moralistic approach where you label particular organizations as countries as imperialist. So in the era of imperialism in the beginning of this last century, the key component was inter-imperialist rivalry, which was the proximate cause of a terrible war, in which everybody swept up. And the other proximate cause was a division within Britain, the key imperialist power at the time, between colonialism and neo-colonialism. So there was a very bitter debate around Ireland. Did the British have to concede any form of Irish independence? And should they either hold on by military force or design some way to hobble an emerging democracy? And this was very, very important, because it was basically the template for the British Empire from there on in relation to other democratic struggles. And not surprisingly, partition became to be one of the favorite weapons of the British whenever they felt they had to withdraw from a country. So that was the contradiction there, and it expressed itself basically through unionism, with one section of the British ruling class say, well, we have to negotiate some limited withdrawal, some limited autonomy, and the other section saying, no, we've got the unionists, we've got the army, and we'll be able to hold this place. Now, within the democratic forces, there were essentially two currents, and the two currents were constitutional nationalism, which was the Irish bourgeoisie, what there was of an Irish bourgeoisie, at least in the south, and what they wanted was greater freedom to build their own industrial base. So they were extremely constitutional, and they didn't want total separation, and they were perfectly willing to send off their supporters to get eaten up in the mincemeat of the European war theatre, and were horrified when things got out of hand. And then there was the revolutionary forces, who were essentially, and this has to be stressed, it was, the revolutionary nationalists were essentially a petty bourgeois current, very radical in themselves, but open to the possibility of swinging left or right depending on which way the class struggle resolved itself. And there was the feminist movement, which was extremely strong, both Britain and Ireland and across Europe. And again, it had a division between bourgeois feminism and radical and socialist feminism, which continued. It represented itself in a sort of north-south split, where, but both struggles were resolved essentially by the victory of reaction, and women's movements as such just disappeared, both in the north and the south, and they were actually replaced with horrific misogyny, summed up by the in the south by the Magdalen laundries, the industrial schools, the cisterns full of dead babies, and among the workers, of course, again, there was also a separation, and it was a separation between reformism and revolution. And in fact, that separation was reaching its peak with the arrival of the First World War and the division of the International Socialist Movement, the Second International, into a reformist current who ended up committing enormous crimes against the workers by supporting the slaughter, and the revolutionary current that was successful in the Russian Revolution and also was part of the impetus for the workers' participation in the 1916 rebellion. Following that, in Ireland, we had the partition, which became the colonial model, and it imposed a very deep sectarianism in the north, and it also completely hobbled and contained the development of southern capitalism. The defeat of the revolution, essentially, which is what partition was, also led to the ascendance of bourgeois nationalism, their alliance with the British, a civil war, and the resulting state, the Free State, which was incredibly reactionary, and where social control was handed more or less directly to the Catholic Church. And despite what many people think, that control has not been surrendered, although the Catholic Church is much less popular. The latest dispute is whether the Irish government will hand over a new national maternity hospital to a private company owned by the church. The women's question, as I say, it led to this utter reaction. In the north, it sort of resolved itself very quickly, where the Unionists set up a Unionist Women's Association led by Lady Londonderry, and it was very much the replication of class and sex. So for example, when there was a charter against Irish independence, the men signed it in their blood, and the women had to go elsewhere and not use blood. But in the south, as I say, the rise of the Catholic Church as a more direct instrument of social control led to massacres and tortures, which are still emerging. And in case anybody thinks that they've been repudiated, the Irish government simply fails to compensate the surviving victims. It just doesn't do it, and it doesn't penalize or punish the church authorities who were involved. Again, in the workers' movement, 1916 uprising, but actually, Irish leftists have celebrated Connolly and the Irish Citizen Army ever since, but they were a very, very tiny minority. And in the national struggle, they were, after the death of Connolly, they were supplanted by the Republican movement itself. And in the trade union labour movement, you had more or less an absolute victory for reformism. And the way in which that mainly expressed itself was in a neutrality on the national question. So once the nascent Irish Labour Party and the nascent trade union movement got established, one of their first efforts was, after sort of some revolutionary movements during the War of Independence, their last big effort was a strike against militarism, which was essentially a call on the Republican side to surrender. And it was largely a failure. In the North, they declared neutrality on the national question, said no to orange and green, we're workers, but it didn't save them because the orange mobs chased the socialist Protestants out of the shipyards as they chased out the Catholics. So I'm going to jump over because what I'm doing here is I'm trying to fill in a sort of Venn diagram, and people can ask me things they want later on. So these same factors are operating today, but of course they've changed. And one of the really striking things is if you were to take the news headlines for granted, if you were to believe them, we're heading for a massive European war. Now, I think it's unlikely that that's what will happen. But what we are facing is, a concerted effort to crush Russia. And if there's any followers of the threat of Russian imperialism, I beg your pardon, but this is a pretty clear-cut mobilization by the traditional great powers to encircle Russia. That's not to deny the right of Ukraine to self-determination, but I don't think that's a central issue here. Now, the thing is, although you have this parallel, it's actually quite different because it's not a struggle between equal powers or more or less equal powers to see who will rule. That issue was resolved in the Second World War with the start of the American century. What it is a new push by Biden to reassert a decaying imperialist rule. And that decay affects the US, and it means, for example, I think that puts at a very low priority the possibility that the US will launch a shooting war or commit massive troops. That would not be welcome by a population who've just seen them withdraw ignominiously from Afghanistan. Secondly, it will put immense pressures on the European Union, which is already in pretty sharp decline and unable to assert itself either economically or politically. And number three, you can see the continued decline of UK, of British imperialism. In the beginning of the last century, they were the undisputed world power, and nowadays they've sort of pulled back into sort of populist reaction around Brexit that instead of making them stronger, makes them weaker and weaker. The next theme I want to take up is the theme of nationalism, and I'll address that internationally. So what we find is that national independence is a very valuable prize for those who win it. But it doesn't resolve the class question. So one of the most urgent and direct effects of Irish independence was the the battle to free India, a battle that was successful, but also a battle that was resolved with partition of the continent. uh, in a copycat operation by the British. And what we saw then was over that period, and I don't know an awful lot about the history of India, but what we see is a decay of the nationalist movement and a growing corruption. And that growing corruption has now led to the growth of a very right-wing phenomena in Hindu nationalism. But for the vast majority of Indian workers, the situation is extremely dire. And the other example is even more extreme and more interesting in its relation to its relation to Ireland is the South African struggle, because the South Africans government arrived here after independence, after the end of white rule, and said to the Irish Republicans, here's the template for peace and justice. And we can see how that's turned out in South Africa. And again, the end of white rule is undoubtedly a massive benefit to the population, but the whites kept their economic power. The small layer of the black bourgeoisie have enriched themselves incredibly, and one of the heroes of the South African Revolution, Cyril Ramaphosa, is now the president of South Africa and has his name inscribed on the massacre of miners at where was it, Mariposa?
Marikana.
Marikana, is that right? So what it is what I'm saying is we had this century of national self-determination, which never quite resolved itself. So, the solution to the Palestinian question, as far as imperialism is concerned, seems now to be extermination of Palestine. That seems to be what's on offer. But it also showed that, with only political independence, what arises is neocolonialism, and the major imperialist powers continue to exert themselves, not directly, but through economic control. So in Ireland, and in the south, you had a century of neocolonialism, and one of the results is there's a couple of results. One of the main results is that Ireland never really developed a public sector that's any way comparable to the rest of the other European countries. And so essentially all these services are very largely privatized, and the Irish government has committed itself to running what are largely private services funded by transnational capital. And that's especially the case in the current housing crisis, where, basically the vast majority of the population really have no hope of owning a home, and will find that a rental property will soak up probably the majority of their income. And even then, there's not enough houses. And at the same time, vulture capital floods in from across the world, because the Irish government guarantee them twice the return that they'll get if they, for example, were to invest in Amsterdam. In the north, you had the eventual collapse of what was basically straight military rule and sectarian rule, but what was replaced by is power sharing, which is essentially never worked. Stormont has collapsed. I forget how many times, and the unions say they desperately want to collapse it again. And Brexit, there's two things that are happening now. One is Brexit, in the sense that the unionists are sort of trying to present Brexit and the Irish Protocol as a fatal blow to the association with Britain, which it isn't. But at the same time, they're incredibly unpopular within the unionist population, because most people thought that we're against Brexit and think that the compromise actually is the best way to ensure economic survival. So that's now been fragmented. That throws up another thing, which is that if there's an election and unionism is fragmented, then Sinn Fein will emerge as the largest party, and they will assume the title of First Minister. Now, the thing is, as I say, it has never worked. And one of the things that doesn't work about it is the unions don't accept it. So the next big crisis in the North will be, if Sinn Féin nominate a First Minister, will any of the unionist parties nominate a Deputy First Minister? And the chances are they won't. They've only accepted the situation so far, as long as sort of quietly everybody agreed that they could be in charge and they would have the big slice of the cake. So we're looking forward in another couple of months to another collapse in our structures. I want to say a few words about the women's question as well. Oh, sorry, I've left a few. Oh, yes. I want to say a few things about the women's movement. There, at the time of civil rights in Ireland, there was a rise of a new feminist movement, and it had a big, long struggle. The first feminist demonstration was women rushing down from Belfast to Dublin, waving contraceptives out the window. But there was another 10-year struggle, I think, or 15-year struggle before contraception was legalized, and then it's only very recently that there's been limited abortion rights allowed. Can I say that in the North, and there was, at the head of the Troubles, there was a big division between revolutionary feminists who saw the feminist struggles as linked to the national struggle and said, well, we'd resolve most of this by driving out the British. And a more unionist women's movement says, well, the civilization of the metropole will eventually civilize the North, and we'll have women's rights that way. And essentially, both movements collapsed. The mass of radical women joined Sinn Féin after the hunger strikes, and the first thing that they were told when they joined was, well, we can't support abortion rights because that'll cost us votes. Sinn Féin still don't support abortion rights. They have adopted a more vague wording on it, but that's about as far as it goes. And I just want to mention a couple of other things there which are connected. One is the rise of identity politics. And in terms of the women's movement, and I know there's a big dispute about this, but certainly my opinion is that the rise of self-identity, gender self-identity, is a dagger at the rights of women. The most recent example in Scotland is somebody said she was running a crisis centre for women, but only for females. And she was interviewed by the police and threatened with prosecution, so I don't see how that can be interpreted other than a restriction on women's rights. And the other thing is that the movements that were present in Ireland at the end of the hunger strike have all been transformed. So if you talk about rights, you're basically talking about NGOs. And of course, the NGOs are actually paid for by the government. So the radicalism that exists is extremely dilute and constrained. And I'll give you one example. As I said, there's very sharp criticism of the Irish capitalists' plan for providing housing, which involves massive influx of transnational capital and a constant upward pressure on house prices and on rents. Well, the implementation body, one of the major figures on it, is Patricia King, who's the leader of the Irish trade union movement. So that means that the Irish trade union movement is not functioning as an opposition to a fairly direct attack on the Irish working class. And the last thing I want to say about that is that the socialist movement have fallen backwards, and because they've fallen backwards, they have started to materially, because there's been a big collapse in struggle, their main activity is electoral, and that's become a big problem for two reasons. One is that, in actual fact, the main source of income and the way in which they keep members and full-timers in office is income they receive from paid office, from electoral office. And because of that, you get I'll give you an example. You get very vague reformist programs that people think will not offend, right? So if I give you an example, recently the US insisted that there would be a 15% corporation tax globally. And after a lot of arm twisting, the Irish government signed up. So the Irish government signed up. They get a special offer that they can still keep a lower level of corporation tax internally. This is debated in Parliament and goes through in about an hour. Not one of what used to be called the radical left said anything. Their program is not that, you would think even a reformist could say, well, 15% is too little. How about 20? But what their demand is, well, we should insist they actually pay this 15% because they don't. So there's this consensus, nationalist consensus around nationalism, right? And it's a national dependence where everybody realizes that the Irish economy is dependent on imperialism. In fact, the Irish economy is dependent on 20 transnational companies who pay the bulk of the corporation tax. And even though they pay a low rate, they've sunk so many reserves into a tax haven that the amount guarantees a good return to the Irish government. So what next? And I don't mean that in the sense of, what do we do next? Or I'm looking into my crystal ball. It's more in the sense of how will things now pan out? Well, the first thing is that we can see, my opinion is that the decay of imperialism will continue, but the decay isn't the same as the collapse of imperialism. So you're going to see a new barbarism, and you're seeing it. You're seeing it in Europe at the minute, but you see it in Biden's attempt to encircle China, in his attempt to encircle Iran, in his bolstering of Israel, and in this absolute barbarism in Afghanistan, where, as a parting gift, he's leaving the Afghans the gift of starvation, and more or less without any criticism. I think we can see that the Americans in all these confrontations are actually using their control of the banking system as the main weapon of choice. And the issue then becomes, at what point will that break down? Clearly, there's a whole series of operators who would like to break that, but it's very, very difficult to do. But if that becomes the main weapon of the Americans, then there has to be a counter weapon. As I say, in Ireland, the economy is in the hands of 20 transnationals. And I can't stress enough the lack of independent class activity at the minute. And what has happened is, well, there's two things happening at once. One is that the suffering that people have been through has made the traditional bourgeois parties incredibly unpopular. So for most of the history of the Irish Free State, the Fianna Fáil could rule alone, and then it became impossible for it to rule, and then there was an alternative rule with Fine Gael and Labour, and now today you have to stick all of them together to get a majority in Parliament, and there's really very little doubt but that Sinn Fein will come out as the major, not the leader, but the party with the plurality, the biggest vote. Although what will happen is not clear. It may not be absolutely essential they be included in government, but it's likely that they will be in government. And a lot of people are putting a lot of faith in that, basically because there isn't anything else. They're strangled in this housing crisis. Sinn Féin say they have a solution to the housing crisis. And they're the only major party that hasn't been in a coalition government. So there's this, desperation and belief maybe they'll be able to sort it out. So they're likely to retain this big vote. The problem is that there's absolutely no grounds for believing that they'll be able to do that. First of all, their big scheme is that we won't have developers. We'll use state land and we'll put in the money directly. Now, the houses will still be built privately, but we'll take a lot of the money, man. And then the question becomes, well, where do you get the money? And they're saying, simple, we'll ask the European Central Bank, which is the standalone claim of all the reformist strategies in the South Ireland. Everybody just ignores the fact that the central bank has had them by the neck for decades and squeezed. The Irish population paid 46% of the European banking debt after the credit crunch. So the idea that the central bank is going to cut us a bit of slack is just crazy. But people are really desperate, and there's this very low level of class consciousness. The other thing I want to say about Sinn Féin is twofold, I think. One is there's a lot of evidence. They're in government in the north, and in fact, in government in the north, they look very like Fianna Fáil, um, because one of the main activities, there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of sharing out of sectarian spoils with the opposition. But the main activity going on is actually, again, uh, the flooding in of transnational capital around property deals in Belfast city centre and other centres. Uh, and you know, if anybody were paying attention to Sinn Fein in the north, they would not believe for a second that Sinn Fein had a radical solution to housing in the south. Um, Now, the thing is that in the north, people are aware of this decay, of this corruption that's very widespread. Uh, but there's no real alternative. So the main result is likely to be a slow decay. In fact, it's already happened. There's been a number of years where the Sinn Féin vote has slowly decayed, and it's got less, but there's nobody else to vote for, so they retain their position as the nationalist party, if you like. Uh, but the situation within unionism is a hell of a lot worse, because, as I say, unionism has accepted the situation because if they band together, the majority, and if they're a majority, they control the administration. So even though they still hate Sinn Féin being in the government in some sense, as long as they're in charge, they're able to accept that to some extent. But if they splinter, if they're unable to weld together a majority, then the chances are Sinn Féin will arise, and that's likely to bring the whole house of cards tumbling down. And as one of our own members said in a recent analysis, in 2 months, we're going to have the most sectarian election for at least since the setup of the Good Friday Agreement, because it will only have one object, and that's to keep the Catholics out of first place in government. There won't be any other issues. Now, the problem is that this sort of level of decay won't fall apart, because everybody all the traditional leaderships have reached consensus. And I think the most important one here is the trade union leadership. They're so fervently keen on retaining a local administration, on retaining peace, whatever you call peace and whatever price it is, that one of the prices of the last big settlement was Fresh Start, which included an absolutely massive austerity program. And the trade union leadership said, we'll accept that as austerity because keeping the Stormont administration in place is more important than defending the standard of living of the workers. And you can imagine the level of political activity there is when that's what they believe and practice. I'll say something about the small socialist groups. The small socialist groups are all essentially, there's the Communist Party, who have not changed very much over the years. In a sense, the Good Friday Agreement is their program, because what they said is it would be ultra left to press for a united Ireland, and what we need is a stage where we have a democratic Northern Ireland. It's always been the position of our organisation that there isn't any. There's no such thing. The whole point of Northern Ireland is it's not democratic. It was set up as a sectarian fortress, and but that was been our role. Now, the thing about the if you like, the traditional Trotskyist movement, in the sense of the British SWP and the SP, they've always seen the the national question is a sort of not central to socialism, is something off to one side. The Socialist Party are, although they sort of take umbrage, are essentially a unionist organisation. They're all for a united Ireland, but only in the sense of a unity of the Great British Islands when everybody loves each other. And the SWP made their biggest theoretical impact with a work about 30 years ago that said Ireland is an independent capitalist country. We should have traditional class demands and forget all this nonsense about republics and so on. And the effect of that is that they've become parliamentary reformists. And the problem for them is that there's a lot of scrambling for the parliamentary reformist space. And at the moment, in the South, it's held by Sinn Fein. So the most likely thing to happen to the Irish socialist groups in the next Southern election is they'll be wiped out. Sinn Fein didn't stand enough candidates in the last election because they didn't expect to do well. There was a lot of surplus votes, and a lot of the Sinn Fein voters give their extra votes to the left and they get in. But only one of them would have got into government without those Sinn Féin votes, and they won't be available this time around. And one of the effects of if you're absolutely dependent on parliamentarism, you tend to write your program to appeal to the voters, and that means you've less and less to say on a theoretical level about what the class struggle is, what the tasks for the workers are, and so on. So that's the situation. It's a pretty grim one. What can we do about it? Well, what's the tasks of socialists? The task of socialists is to provide a critique of capitalism. And so that's what we should be. And in a sense, there's been a wee theme of that in this talk. I tried to describe the evolution of imperialism in very sketchy terms, and I've tried to sketch out the evolution of bourgeois nationalism and republicanism since the foundation of the Irish state and the partition of the country. And the present day description involves both a decay of imperialism. It involves this massive financialization. It involves the constant pressure to smash up public services and extract more profit from them. And it involves the decay of what used to be the opposition forces. So we try and describe that. And how do we sort of decide, how do we not have 1,000 competing schemes about how capitalism's working today? Well, the answer in Marxism is praxis. So you see what people do, what workers do, and then you adjust what you thought in terms of what they do. Now, you could argue that the workers aren't doing anything at the moment, but the truth is, worker struggles break out all the time. What you find in Ireland is they break out and then they're smothered by the sheer rigidity and inertia of the traditional leaderships, but they're there. And kind of give one example. There was a very popular struggle by the nurses a couple of years ago in the South, and it had overwhelming support. It was 100%, but the bureaucracy settled it within the agreement that they'd made with the government and employers. So, in order to go beyond what was happening, the nurses had to be able to break that agreement, and they weren't able to do it. In a similar way, there was again a very popular and well supported transport workers strike, and it was settled, but it was settled within the terms of the existing agreement. And the existing agreement involves a continued mass privatization of transport. And out of that praxis and out of that description, we should develop a program for the workers that, even if it's just a statement, is at least a statement of what is. And for long periods, that's what the socialists have had, a statement of what is and what the workers should have to do if they want to advance beyond their current position. And that can only be done by workers operating independently. And that's where things are difficult at the minute. The stage is cluttered up with organizations which have decayed. So I'm going to stop there because I've gabbled on for quite a long time. I'm going to say one other thing I left out completely, mentioning the fact that, of course, we're all going to die because imperialism's promise to fix the planet are all lies. But I'm aware that that's one other task for later on.